All right, this is going to be sort of like a case study, like they teach you in an MBA course of something that happened in the past, so you know all the answers. It took place from 1984 till 1992 or 94, but it's all done. And with the advent of the internet, I can go back and find out everything that was going on at the time that I didn't know about. So we'll do some of that. So this is what the typical medical device goes through. You've got a concept, looks pretty good. You want to get it, so you get some seed money. You need to do the science studies. You make a breadboard, you do some feasibility, the marketing, product development, animal testing, transfer to manufacturing. Then you're into the clinical studies through the regulatory approval and then market introduction. Well, this is what started it all. It's called laser wars. Back in the 80s, there was a company in Southern California that had an Argon laser. They were going to ablate tissue for blocked arteries. People at Cedars-Sinai had one of these lasers, and they looked at it, and they saw it just burns tissue. They said, that's not nice. And Warren Grudfest, here, second to the, next to Forrester there, me, and then he was a surgeon, but he was very familiar with science. He went to science camp, and he knew about lasers. And he says, you know, the Excimer lasers, IBM's using Excimer lasers to ablate tissue, and they're looking on, polymers, and they looked at tissue. Well, we could use an Excimer laser, and it doesn't burn. And so they looked around for an Excimer laser, and they came to me because I developed the first one, had basic patents on it. And so this was the timeline. I went to JPL actually to produce lasers, study the reactions in 1972, and I had R&D funding, and I had a Caltech President's Fund to support the laser source. So when they came to me, they had a NIH grant, and they said, we want to do this laser, Excimer laser, but they're not really available. You can't buy it. So I went there and made a presentation, and they gave them the grant based on the fact that they had a laser in their backyard. So the advantage that we had versus most companies, I had two laboratories. They had an NIH grant at Cedars-Sinai. For 2 years, we did all the basic science studies on somebody else's dime, not the venture capitalist's dime. So I actually got money from Cedars-Sinai to build them a laser. They raised $100,000. They sent it to JPL. Piece of cake, I don't leave. Guess what? They sent the money to Washington, D.C. They didn't pass a budget. They impounded it for 2 months. I can't spend it. So we said, you know, I can't do anything here. We have to get out. So we raised some venture funds. And if anybody wants to ask, I can tell you how those things work. And we began clinical trials in 1987. We passed the FDA PMA panel review in 1990. And then we had several rounds of VC funding up to 1990, and an IPO in 91 before we got the final approval, which was out of desperation. Okay, back in the day, we all knew what the FDA was. Okay, you're going to be treating patients, so you have to, they're going to review everything to make sure it's safe and effective for new devices. That's their charter. There's two methods of getting it. One is a 510K. That means it's similar to a device that already exists, and the other is a PMA. It's for new devices. This was a new device, so it had to go through a panel review. You had the FDA on there. You had various physicians and experts that would evaluate your clinical results. So what are the factors influencing the regulatory system? Well, there's the science of medical criteria. That's what we were good at. We knew how to do that. We had the labs, and then when we left to start the company, Warren built my lab down at Cedars-Sinai, so we could do any study outside of the company because we're now manufacturing things and doing clinical trials. But one thing that's people don't look at is our principal agency concerns. Now, you know what that is in business. You know, you have to incentivize people to give you the charter you want. But it's the same thing that people started looking at in the government. How do how do you incentivize whatever the regulatory is to give you the desired result for the stakeholders they're representing? And there's some things in there that I'll go through and you'll see them emerge. But the main thing that you have in the FDA is the aligning the risk-reward for the regulatory charter, because most of it's asymmetric. You make a mistake, you're in trouble. Do you get rewarded for approving something that saves lives? Maybe, I don't know. So it's, and the other thing is information and the resource to fulfill goals. And the biggest thing that we went through was the changing political priorities that affect the agency. So we're dealing with business, we're dealing with regulatory, there's all kinds of conflicts, right? There's conflicts in business. We had conflicts, who gets resources to do this, to do that, who gets rewarded. You're fighting with that all the time. The same thing with physicians. Back in the time, for a heart, we just had Grunsik come up with a balloon. And then we had John Simpson come up with a over-the-wire balloon that allowed anybody to do it. And then people say, well, this thing really works. So we had atherectomy. We had rotablator. We had DVI by John Simpson and the laser. So physicians are working on studies, but sometimes they have stock. What's the conflict? How do you analyze? This guy has stock, that guy doesn't. Is the results he's giving? And the FDA has to make those determinations, because when a guy says, well, I got stock, how do you evaluate that? And then there was political pressure in the FDA back then. There was a Safe Medical Device Act. There was a high product failures, so the FDA was under fire. That's political. All of a sudden, the politicians want to put emphasis on clinical utility along with safety and efficacy. In other words, you control some of the healthcare costs, and I'll show you how that came up. And then there's generic politics and budgetary issues. Congress would add additional duties to the FDA, of course, without increasing your budget, right? They do this. And then there were proposals to have industry pay for FDA fees and approvals, and there's a conflict. Do we want to pay for something that takes 5 years? How do we all work together? So all these things are in the mix, stirring things up, and you have to deal with everything. Scientific issues were easy. It's black and white, You do a pulse or CW laser. Well, a pulse laser doesn't heat the tissue, but what wavelength? What's the delivery system? So we had to solve all those problems, and we did. And then we had this concern, we're at 308 nanometers. Well, that's UVB, that's mutagenic. So we ran into a problem with that. So let me read this. This is a paper that was published. The evidence cited above makes it clear that 308 nanometer light is a potent mutagen, and that laser treatment of atherosclerosis using photons at this wavelength may have serious side effects. The wait-and-see attitude encouraged by some investigators is unacceptable. To our knowledge, no evidence nor any arguments have been put forth in the literature to justify the radiological safety of 308 nanometer. Researchers, companies experiment with this new technology need to make their case. So what does everybody do when that's a competitive thing? And I said, this is an MIT professor, why this? Well, it turns out I'm having my car repaired in Redondo Beach. I told the guy I was working in lasers. He says, oh yeah, I used to work in lasers for this professor at MIT back in Massachusetts. I said, why is he doing this? He says, well, because he's funded by Edwards. And he has an Argon laser, which he showed burns. And he likes to go to the Santa Barbara meeting in September. And of course, this goes, when your competitors get there, they complain to the FDA, you have to prove this, that you're safe mutagenic. I'm going to go back. I was at a meeting in Florida. I think it was either NIH or FDA sponsored, because when we were doing this, everybody was involved. The FDA, the NIH, everybody wanted to find out if this thing would work, and we were all working together. And I went to this meeting, and I was going to talk about Excimer laser angioplasty 308. The first guy that gave a talk was giving a talk for LASIK, but the guy didn't show up. So this guy had written a safety book on lasers, and he started, I'm going to give a talk about LASIK, but let me say this, that 193 nanometers is a ionizing radiation, it's mutagenic, and if I was in a government agency, I would never fund anybody to do this without proving that it was safe. You know, the people at this meeting were 2 LASIK companies and me. And well, that was his opinion. And then he talked about LASIK. So then I got up and I showed something like this. This is one of our cases, total occlusion in the leg. You can see the vessels missing. You can see the laser go through, and when the low pressure balloon is working. So I showed my first case. We were working in a corner back there. I said, see this patient? They got a problem. I said, oh my God, how did you see that? It's X-ray. It's ionizing. It's mutagenic. Why are we doing this? But that's not good enough. So what did I do? Turns out we were still fortunate. We weren't. When I was at JPL, it turns out there was a president of the Photobiology Society, professor, was in a sabbatical there. And when the mutagenic issue came up, I talked to him about it. And he told me how to culture some cells and irradiate it with light, of course, but I'm killing everything. So I'm ablating it. So it's not working. So when all this controversy came, I called him up. I said, look, we're having a big problem. The FDA has asked us, what about this 308? It's a fair question to ask. Everybody's asking. So I paid him to do a study of the literature of what the effect is at 308. And I told him what our dosage was, you know, what we were doing, what the scattered and penetration depth was. And so he wrote a report, and he told me, he says, you know, I was looking this up, and in the literature, there's 2 sets of numbers for 308. One's higher than the other. And I talked to each side, and they say, well, the other guy doesn't know what he's doing. So there's no comparison between these 2 different classes of data. And he said, I found out what it was. They're doing mammalian cells, but one side is doing nocturnal animals, which have no repair mechanism for UV, and the other one's using animals that go in light. Solve the problem. And so he submitted that to the FDA because they wanted it, and that was fine. We never had that problem come up again because most of it was people that were either infrared laser guys or CW laser guys that weren't really, didn't really work for this particular application. So that went away. Okay, so what was our interaction with the FDA? It was great. We were all working on a problem. We had meetings just for the laser applications because they were so new, sponsored by the FDA, sponsored by FDA. In fact, the head of one of the head of the branch of the NIH came out for Warren when he dedicated his laser lab and wrote a letter to JPL because I was having trouble getting this laser built because they were tying up my funds to support us. They were working with us. Everything was, if there's a question, answer it. And we go in the lab and answer it. It's much harder to do if you're in a company because that's money. You have to have the equipment, and you have to have the trained people and answer those questions. But we were fortunate. We always met with the FDA to discuss protocol, so we knew what we needed on the clinical trials and everything else. Again, book chapters. They wrote chapters in the books on the laser angioplasty, the atherectomy. They were all supportive of whatever technology would help cure heart disease, which is the number 1. So we figured, this is great. It's a partnership. At the panel meeting, things changed. Why? Politics. There was a problem with our FDA submission, PMA submission. We did 100 patients in the coronary with lesions, and we were looking for approval of restenosis rates because we're removing tissue. And we had 6-month follow-up with angiographic data to see if it had restenosed. And we had been working with a cardiologist that had our laser but was also on the panel. And the people that put together, our clinical people that put together, just put the raw data in, didn't analyze it, how it compared with other techniques. So they sent this thing to him, to this cardiologist. He looked at it and said, well, you haven't said anything. It's just raw data. How do we interpret it? And so they're very concerned in the company. Well, we have a PMA. We've worked, I don't know how many years on that, 1986 to 1990, and we got feedback that we haven't analyzed our data. Because how's a panel going to analyze it? It's raw data. So I got involved because they were all flipping out. And so I went to the literature and I found a paper that had, for restenosis of balloon angioplasty, it just appeared. It was a multi-center trial of a variety of institutions and statistically analyzed at the University in Pittsburgh. And they found out that there were 3 types of lesions in the coronary. There were A, B, and C lesions, depending on length. And the A lesions had very low restenosis. B had higher, and C were terrible. They're like 60%. Well, we had our raw data had the length, and when we looked it up, we did much better with the C lesions. All I needed was the data at 6 months. Their data was at 12 months. So I couldn't get data for 6 months from the paper. So I called up the epidemiologist that had done the paper, and I said, could you take our data and compare it to the 6-month data of your registry? And he said, yeah, well, a little fee, and we'll have a party for my people. So I sent her some money, and we got the data, and we got view graphs. And when we went to the panel meeting, we had some data that explained our results, but it wasn't in the PMA. It was presented at the meeting. Now, one of the problems is the company, when we presented this data at the meeting, all our competitors were there. It's an open system, so everything you've done, they know. And we had figured out what this technology was good for compared to the existing technology. 2 weeks later, our competitor was at the ACC. They had all the data presented the same way. They went through the panel meeting, and they got 6 indications because they had their data figured out from what we presented. But that's the part. FDA is supposed to say it's approved, but everybody knows about it. I didn't realize how many people were competitors at that meeting until later when I ended up in court with them on patents and everything else. Okay, well, what happened after we, at the panel meeting in 1991? And first of all, Congress didn't pass the budget again. I've run this problem before. Well, they were going to cancel the PMA meeting because if they can't pay people's salary. And the people that were supposed to come, the outside experts, didn't know what to make travel plans. So we were missing one person, and he was a cardiologist. So only 5 panel members showed up due to the uncertainty whether the meeting was going to be held or not. Now, if a meeting was canceled, it would probably be a couple months. And when you're funded by VC, time is money. Because until you get approval, you can't really sell. At that time, we could charge for the equipment for the IDE clinical site. So that sort of kept us alive a little bit. Well, the panel review went well. We answered all the questions. We presented the data. It was clearly better than the balloon angioplasty for the long lesions. But the lead reviewer was a cardiologist, and he felt restenosis was too high because he had read the raw data, and we had this meeting that was all new to him, and so it hadn't sunk in. And then we had a biomechanical engineer asked about the price of the laser, because we were selling it for like $250,000 because you couldn't buy anything like that. And there were a lot of competitors say, well, if they get through and deliver so many lasers, we'll never be able to get through because these lasers are expensive back in the day. But there's an industry representative on the FDA panel, and he says, well, that's not the FDA's charter. You can't talk about that. And so that went away. But then there were turf wars. The surgeon expressed that surgery, of course, is better. And the pathologist was with the surgeon, and we only had 2 cardiologists. And they were debating because they were trying to analyze data that they heard for the first time. That's our fault. Fortunately, we had Dr. Forrester. I mentioned about Dr. Forrester. He was an English major, and he's just written a best-selling book called The Heart Healers. It's about the development of all the surgical techniques and the balloon angioplasty. And it's really an excellent book of how all these things got developed. And he summarized everything very clearly and let it be known that you know, if you cardiologists want new tools, you better let the surgeons have a sway. And there was another subtle thing that occurred. We had a prominent cardiologist that had our laser. He had stock from our company, and he was with us. And when he gave the introduction that he had stock, the person on the board, the cardiologist on the board that had no stock, gave him the old eye, and he was afraid to say anything after that. He didn't say a word because he thought he would compromise his reputation, because that was sort of a new thing with investigators getting part of equity in the company, even though wasn't going to be that much compared to what he was making. But it really affected the dynamics of the presentation. But at the end, we got a 3-2 vote, but only for long lesions. And this was pervasive. After that, all atherectomy devices tend to get approved for niches, whereas balloons could be used anywhere based on. So this is where the problem. So we passed the panel meeting, and usually when you pass the panel meeting, the FDA approves it in a reasonable amount of time. But this is what I found out later because everything went quiet. There was a problem with some of the people in the generic drugs taking money to hold a certain laboratory from getting approval. And they hired a detective, and they found that out, and so it was sort of a big problem with the FDA, and so John Dingell got involved in this and reacted, and he put a member of his staff in the FDA. And after that, no one would talk to us. We used to talk to reviewers every day. What's going on? Nothing. Can't talk. Can't do it. They were stymied. Then Dingell had one view, HHS had another view, and there was a turf war between the two. And there was no new FDA commissioner for 8 months. Well, we can't do anything about that. And the FDA was sort of hand-tied because until they got things sorted out, nothing could occur. So for 2 years, medical device approvals in limbo. We used to talk to these people on a regular basis. We used to meet them at meetings. Now if you call them and say, well, we really can't talk with you right now because we haven't got a charter yet of what we can do. They had to get this political stuff solved out. So these medical laser companies, LASIK and ourselves, were desperate because 2 years without approval, you can't sell, and you're running out of money. So what we did, we had to go premature IPO to get the money. One company that was in the Excimer went to the vice president, and that went nowhere. The other one went to Senator Ted Kennedy, and somehow they were able to get approval. And there were some things that occurred that information from one company got released to the other company, and nobody knew what went on. But we were still in limbo. What happened? 2020. 2020 was a news show, and we were getting feedback from our clinical trial physicians that they were calling and they were asking about the product, but they didn't want to know anything good about it. They only wanted to know something negative. And they come and said, well, I try to tell them it's good, but they don't want to hear it. They just want to hear negative stuff. So we said, okay, one of our competitors got to them, and they probably want to do a piece, and we haven't got approval, and it's going to come out to be a very negative story. But we learned that they were going to then interview David Kessler, do a gotcha on him. And so we were saying, well, what do we do? So what we did, it was the CEO, myself, and the regulatory affairs. I said, well, let's give David Kessler a call and tell him what's going on, because they're going to set him up. And so we did. We called his chief of staff. He said, 2020 is going to call you. They're going to do an interview. They're doing a negative story on us. We don't have approval, but just a heads up. The day of the 2020 news piece, Kessler approved the PMA. He made a release in Health and Human Services saying, this device will help save lives. It will definitely provide a benefit. Well, that ruined their story They came out the same day. They had a heads up. They finally had to put a positive patient who couldn't have any other treatment that was able to go back to a normal life. So it was a wash. There's other things that occurred at that panel meeting, not FDA, but marketing and everything else. At that panel meeting before us was the Palmant stent. And it was presented by J&J, and we were there, and I'm looking at it, and I said, they're presenting a marketing story. It's not scientific. It's like a brochure for the stent. I said, they're going to go down. This is ridiculous. But they passed. And it turns out a major problem with balloon angioplasty is abrupt closure of the vessel. And the person would have to go to surgery because it would close off. And that occurred with about 5% of the cases. So once that was approved, there was a real good reason to put stents in anything that had a dissection, because the way balloon angioplasty works, it cracks the tissue or expands it beyond the elastic limit, and then it can collapse in a few cases. So it was a very important thing for the cardiologists to have a bailout device. But they started putting it in everything, and it was very expensive. In 1993, Hillary Clinton was pushing a Health Care Reform Act. She attacked the high price of pharmaceutical manufacturers, the high profit gouging companies. Well, the response was that I think the industry got together and they had all kinds of commercials and things saying that this is going to be the worst thing since sliced bread. But what happened, which I was, I'm looking at this, the drug companies were under the gun. And so what they did is they took all their R&D expenses and put them up front so they wouldn't have a profit in the next quarter, because they didn't want to look bad. If they reported a big profit while this thing was going on, they would be in. They couldn't defend themselves. So what I did is I bought Merck and Pfizer because I knew it was artificial. When the Hillary Clinton thing failed, they went back to reporting their income. So the combination of stent usage, which was a high cost, and the belt tightening, because everybody reacted to Hillary Claire. I remember I was in the Northwestern, and they were going to be a clinical trial, and the laser was $250, and the administrator came in and said, "We can't afford that." And the cardio says, "Yes, we can. You're going to buy it for me." After this, we had a cardiologist from Indianapolis says, "We use the laser because we use a low-pressure balloon. It's better for the patient, but we were told because with stents and everything else, we have to cut down on our spending, and so you can't use the laser. It's too expensive." So with this kind of change in your market forces, the $250K laser was now a freebie. And we just charge double for the catheters for the usage. So you have to respond to the marketplaces. It's nothing to do with the FDA. It has all to do with political things that change your landscape. But anyway, eventually, after these LASIKs and we got through, they hadn't, I think in 1 year they only approved 12 medical devices. But now they had Kessler, everything, they had settled everything, and Dingle had his people out of the FDA, and things went back to normal. So let me give you a couple of things. The early working relationship with the FDA was a partnership. I thought they were part of my lab. I mean, if somebody said, "What about mutagenicity?" they say, "Give us some data. So we gave them the data. If we had a problem with this, give me the data." We gave them the data. It should not be adversarial. You can work up front with the FDA. That's what they're telling you now. If you have a device, go with them, talk with them, give them your plan. They work with you. Because if you don't give them your plan and you put it and they say, "Well, I don't like this," no, you lost all that time. This is one thing I have. Corruption in business or government is typically caused by the individuals, not the institution. You got laws. Punish the people that did the thing. Because when you punish the institution, they punishes your client. And you can see this. I mean, if you look at the overreaction, I would talk at Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank. They had laws in the books when people went bad, and they put new laws that makes it very difficult. It puts a dead weight on business and everything else, and it doesn't give you any more protection. It just gives you more regulation. But this is the problem with you can't stop political change. You can only react to them. The other thing that I found in going through that, and I find that even a little bit today, is information flow. There's more ways of information now. In the old days, a submission was by paper. We had a stack of paperwork that high for the PMA. And that has to be reviewed by several people in the FDA, like 15 volumes. It's done sequentially. So it has to go from one desk to another desk. I think we were working on electronic submission because they can all review it in parallel. Especially if somebody takes vacation. It's on a desk for 2 weeks and then they come back. So the information flow. The other thing, written words and engineering drawings can mask information. I have this trouble with the patent office. They don't want to read words, they look at drawings, and if they don't interpret the drawing right, you could lose like a year in trying to explain it. So one of the things that can explain things, and especially in devices, are videos and photos. They're more lucid. There's more information in the photos. So we had a problem with my current company that we don't use fiber optics. We use a liquid-filled catheter. And we had a question, well, what happens if you break the fiber when you bend the catheter? Well, wait a minute, there's no fiber in there. Because written words don't explain everything. But one of the things we started to go to some of the meetings, even though we can't sell anything. And the FDA goes to these meetings. And they come by our booth, and we say, look at these angiograms. Look at what we're doing. Here's the catheter, touch it, feel it. Here's the laser. Oh, I never understood that from reading your submission. So if you can't get that kind of information there, display your product. The FDA goes to a lot of meetings, and they come around to your booth if you're under review. And it's a very good way to actually explain what you're doing. And the other thing, you say, well, turf wars don't occur with the physicians. But I went to deliver a laser at a hospital in Pittsburgh. I was brought in by the marketing manager there. And she says, you're going to make 3 presentations, one to the cardiologists, one to the surgeons, and one to the radiologists. I said, why can't I talk all at once? He says, because I won't get in the same room together. They were all competing with each other for patients. And that's one of the realities that you go through. But, looking back, I sort of agree with Steve Jobs. The reward was a journey. We got to develop a lot of technology. You don't know how many patients we helped because we had niches that they couldn't be treated by any other things. And the current stuff that we're doing right now, we're taking people that are going to lose their foot because they got total occlusions and you can't really go through those very easily. And we've been saving people's feet. They go home in 2 days and they walk to church in a week. And they're 83, 93 years old. So that's the reward. And that's what we went through. Okay. That's it.